Every 30 seconds, there's a Latino youth that turns 18 years old. We're expecting roughly 14 million Latinos to have turned 18 since the last election in key states.
Welcome to The Context, a podcast about the past, present, and future of democracy from the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. I'm your host, Alex Levitt. My guest today is María Teresa Kumar. Kumar is the president of Voto Latino, an organization she co-founded with actor Rosario Dawson in 2004, and is today the largest Latino voter registration organization in the United States. Kumar also heads the Voto Latino Foundation, an influential Latino youth advocacy organization. She served on President Barack Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing and is a member of a number of important organizations, including the National Task Force on Election Crises and the Council on Foreign Relations. She's also a Kettering Foundation Senior Fellow. Throughout the history of the United States, we've been a diverse country. Our population remains a product of our past diversity. Today, Americans are the descendants of European colonists, the native people who lived here before colonization, the Africans who were enslaved and forcibly brought here, and all the immigrants who have arrived here during the last several centuries from all over the world. But while diversity has been a constant throughout American history, the specific makeup of that diversity has changed over time. In 1980, when for the first time the U.S. Census provided every American the opportunity to identify as Hispanic, a little over 6% of the U.S. population checked that box. In our most recent census in 2020, 19% of Americans identified as Hispanic, making Latinos the second largest ethnic group in the United States and the fastest growing. Latinos will continue to be a growing part of the American population, electorate, and culture over the next few decades. That's not a political statement, that's just a demographic fact. Most of these new Latino Americans are not immigrants. They are the children of immigrants, and their children's children, or the descendants of the people who lived on the land the United States captured in 1848 during the Mexican-American War. This year's election and other future elections may result in substantial changes to the U.S. immigration system. But regardless of future immigration policy, the Latino share of the American population will continue to grow for many decades to come. So it's pretty important for the health of American democracy to make sure that Latinos are registered and enabled to vote, that they can participate as informed citizens, and that elected officials understand and represent the specific interests of the Latino community. This is the work that María Teresa Kumar and Voto Latino have been doing for 2 decades. And for those of us who aren't Latino, it's important that we respect the Latino people who already make up an indispensable part of our communities, economy, culture, and democracy. The Kettering Foundation's work is focused on building inclusive democracies in the United States and around the world. No demographic group has a monopoly on democracy. That's contrary to the whole idea. But the next phase of the American experiment truly is untried. We are trying to build a democracy that works for all citizens in a diverse society where soon no single ethnic group will constitute a majority. Talking with María Teresa Kumar gives me confidence that that experiment will succeed and flourish. María Teresa Kumar, welcome to The Context.
Thank you so much for having me.
So 20 years ago, you were one of the co-founders of Voto Latino. Talk to me a little bit about the original vision for that organization. Why was it important to have an organization focusing on voter registration and political engagement specifically for the Latino community?
I came about Voto Latino as everybody in life where nothing is linear, right, Alex? And so it was right after the 2003 American Family Survey that declared Latinos were the second largest demographic of Americans, that Latinos were responsible for 52% of our growth, and that it will be true fast forward in 2010. And the majority of the folks that attributed to this massive growth were not immigrants, but the children of immigrants. So these were American individuals that were contributing to the massive growth in the Latino community. And around the same time, MTV had just launched a campaign in 2004 called Vote or Die. And Rosario Dawson was another marketing gentleman, basically said, Latinos won't die if they don't vote, but no one is talking to the second largest demographic of Americans. Is there a space? So they partnered with MTV and did the very first massive PSA campaign. targeting Latinos in English. And around that same time, a mentor of mine said, Maria Teresa, you've always said that you've wanted to run an organization. This is something that might be of interest to you. And it was of interest to me because I had already worked on the Hill. I had graduated from the Kennedy School of Government. I loved politics, but watching and seeing a Voto Latino PSA was the very first time that someone said out loud that, yes, I was Latina, but that I was a proud American. And on election day of November 2004, I met Rosario, and Rosario Dawson was wonderful and charming and smart and said, look, we just did these PSAs. I don't know if it could be anything more. And I said, how hard can it be to start an organization? Alex, that is what the hubris of a 28-year-old says when they don't know what they're about to get into. But I fell in love because, like I said, it was the very first political ad that I saw myself in. And so I was living in New York at the time. I quit my job, packed my bags, and what every parent dreams of on the eve of their kid's 30th birthday is to get a knock on the door saying, I'm moving home. And that's exactly what I did. And for the first 3 years, I basically Voto Latino charted a new course. I funded it on my credit card for the first 3 years, recognizing that the boom of the Latino community wasn't coming out of California. It was coming out of Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Texas, and Colorado. And so that is how we started Voto Latino. We said, where is the Latino community voting power today? At that time, I'll give you an example of Georgia. Latinos had 2% of the electoral base in Georgia at the time. But then we did something different from what most political calculations are like, how many Latinos are in the classrooms? And at the time in Georgia, it was roughly 15%. Well, that means that in short order, the electoral base in Georgia was going to change really quickly. And I had grown up in California under Pete Wilson, where Pete Wilson decided that he was going to be the big, bad Republican governor by convincing our neighbors to vote for Proposition 187, which was the original Show Me Your Paper laws, and had a chilling effect in California. And I said, if in California, in a progressive community that I grew up in Sonoma, if we can convince our neighbors to be anti-immigrant, what's going to happen to young people and their families in a place like Georgia, in a place like Arizona, where you didn't have such a fast clip of community as you had in the past? And so that's how we set up the organization. But sure enough, we became the largest voter registration organization in those states because we never left. We always had a digital first strategy. I always date myself because I said we started organizing on MySpace when MySpace was a thing. And then we started organizing using text messaging back in 2006 before the iPhone, because we recognized that young people had text messages in their pocket. They were connected to the internet, and they had free minutes on the weekends that we used to leverage when it came to peer-to-peer communication before peer-to-peer was even a thing.
So Voto Latino, and you're known for that kind of early investment in digital organizing. Do you think that that is a strategy that works particularly well for reaching the Latino community? Is that a strategy that should be used generally and in other political organizing?
So one of the things that we know is that because Latinos are vastly so young than the rest of the population, they are absolutely early adopters of technology. They are the fastest purveyors of information on YouTube. They over-index on Twitter. They lead the way on Instagram. And let's not even get started on TikTok. They have always been early adopters, but it's also because they're about 15 years younger than the rest of the country. And so when these apps are targeting young people, by default, it's the vast majority of Latinos. Every 30 seconds, there's a Latino youth that turns 18 years old. We're expecting roughly 14 million Latinos to have turned 18 since the last election, again, in these key states. And one of the things that we've never done is shy away from technology and machine learning and targeting people using authentic communication. And it was because we were not shy to learn the latest when it came to machine learning, when it came to targeting people online, that we were well positioned when the pandemic came. Sadly, because of the pandemic in 2020, a lot of our sister organizations who do the traditional paper and pen voter registration had to shutter. We never shuttered. We literally took 6 days off, quote unquote, so that my team could go back home so that they can settle down. And we entered the pandemic having registered 80,000 folks. We ended the pandemic with a record number of over 650,000 people. 82% who went on and voted. And we did all of that without knocking on a door. But it was because we were meeting our constituency online. We were texting them. They were on radio. They were seeing our billboards, and they were receiving mail from us.
So as you're saying there, a big part of what Voto Latinos successfully done is register people to vote. And I want to ask a little bit about that because that process of registering to vote can look pretty different from state to state. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to what states' policies make it easier to register or harder to register, and how does that impact Voto Latinos' work?
I would say Colorado perhaps has the best model of how to register, and that's same-day registration. That is a model. I would say that California, under Secretary Padilla, now Senator Padilla, he revolutionized the Secretary of State's to identify people that can pre-register at the age of 16. That is government working, right? If we can all agree that we live in a democracy and that a thriving democracy is incumbent that every person has access to the voting booth, what we want is to create minimal friction on being able to get on a voter roll and registering and voting. I live in the District of Washington, D.C. Literally, I can walk in on election day and register to vote and cast my ballot at the same time. I actually don't have to go to any specific precinct. I can cast a ballot anywhere in the city and it is counted towards me. So there's no provisional ballots. That's what we aspire to. The hardest places to register, not surprising, is where you have disproportionate Republican legislators who are trying to prevent the population that is vastly diverse than the people that it govern. Texas, for example, after you saw close to 23% increase in young people voting in 2020, the very first legislative session in January of that year of 2021, Republicans passed legislation that prevented people that had temporary addresses from registering to vote. It sounds innocuous enough, Alex, until you basically scratch the surface and realize that they don't want kids on college campuses who are living in dorms from registering to vote. That's a very specific group of people that they're trying to alienate. In Texas, you also have to be deputized in your area, in your county, in order to register another voter, otherwise face criminal charges. And so it has a chilling effect even from volunteers. And so one of the things that Voto Latino has done is we register, even in Texas, right? Texas is actually one of our number one voter registration states because young people have an appetite to change the state quickly. And we do it through digital marketing and we do it through online and we chase them and we give them conversations, but it is providing them the opportunity for them to engage and learn how they can change a system that doesn't really sit well with them when you're talking about taking, agency over a woman's body because they're banning abortion or because they have some of the worst climate change impacts that they're facing, but very little legislation, or even when it comes to gun reform, the amount of young people who say, look, we believe in smart legislation so that we can have smart gun reform that protects our families is through the roof in Texas. And it's not saying that they want to take guns away. They just want better protections so that people that can potentially target other individuals don't have access to them.
So you're mentioning there Texas, a state where the state government is passing policies to make it harder to register to vote. Also, in August, the Texas Attorney General, raided homes of several individuals working in voter registration, including members of the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, which is a nearly century-old civil rights organization. We're also seeing in Florida new laws this year imposing harsh penalties on voter registration organizations if they miss deadlines. And as a result, the League of Women Voters has stopped submitting paper registration forms on behalf of Florida voters this year. So it sounds like Voto Latino has been successful in addressing some of these challenges, but have these types of policies affected your work?
100%. And it's because we have to inform and combat the disinformation. We have now filed, just in Texas alone, over 5 different federal lawsuits because they are in direct violation of the Mobile Voter Act of Section 2 that is part of the Voting Rights Act. And we oftentimes file first, and then DOJ quickly follows us. And it is by design. It is purposely trying to have a chilling effect on the voter. And if we deeply believe as Americans that the way we pass policy, the way we govern is access to the voting booth, it doesn't matter if we are Republican, Independent, or Democrat. We have to understand that we have to allow access to the voting booth universally for everyone. I'm part of the Universal Voting Task Force. It came out of a project with Harvard University and Brookings. And for 18 months, I sat on a panel with people from all walks of life, independent, moderate, libertarian, academics. And we were all trying to figure out what are the best systems out there when it comes to a functioning democracy. And we looked elsewhere, not in the United States. We looked elsewhere. And one of the things that we found is that when we encourage universal voting, maximum participation in the voting booth, what we find is that politicians are forced to come to the middle because they bring in people that oftentimes say, politics is not for me. So it tones down the temperature of extremism on both sides and makes politicians actually talk about policy. And there's not an American that I know that doesn't want us to get back to that place, right? To governing for the people. And so as we go through the journey, I think one of the things that we need to look at as a country is that we established a lot of these voting rules over 250 years ago with some tweaks of providing more access to Americans. But in the last 10 years, we've been litigating issues that we had already solved for 50 years ago. So what are modernization mechanisms that we can learn and adapt to in this country so that we can get back to governing instead of having cultural wars and extreme views on both sides?
So, of course, if you talk to politicians in Texas or Florida or some of these other states that are passing restrictions on registering to vote, passing new restrictions on the ability to vote, voter ID, for example, they say that these are necessary to prevent voter fraud. And of course, there's not a whole lot of evidence that there's substantial voting fraud happening anywhere in the United States, certainly not at a level that would affect elections results. How does Voto Latino respond to those false claims? How should other organizations talk about that issue?
When people say that they have to put up these voting restrictions because of their concerns of nefarious activity at the voting booth, I remind everybody that in 2020, all 50 states, every single Secretary of State, every single governor, all 50 states certified their elections as free and fair. So if they sign on that dotted line of free and fair, Governor Abbott, Paxton, go down the list in Texas, they know that there is no voting fraud. What they're trying to create is voting friction so that people that all of a sudden are participating are thinking and second guessing themselves of whether to participate. And we are entering election season. And I have to share with you, one of my biggest concerns is that people are going to be intimidated at the polls in a manner that prevents them from casting their fair, free vote. And by doing so, we are not living up to our democratic standards that we make demands elsewhere internationally. I would also encourage folks to know that if someone is found to have voted fraudulently, it's a felony. It's not a slap in the hands. You are facing serious charges. And when folks say, well, we're concerned that an undocumented person is going to, I said, undocumented person, the last thing they're going to do is expose themselves to trying to cast a ballot because, they don't want to be around any of it, right? So it's almost kind of like, again, speaking in dog whistle terminology of trying to say who should have access to the voting booth. These restrictions absolutely limit young people and absolutely limit people of color. And that should, again, in a multicultural society, in a multicultural democracy that we are experimenting with, the only way we thrive is making sure that we have maximum participation and letting go of the friction. I would rather have folks in Texas talk more about the policies that they're promoting so that they could ignite the imagination of the voter to vote for them versus what we're seeing. It's sloppy and unjust.
So we're talking here about one form of disinformation, which is the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen and sort of ancillary lies about voter fraud in other elections. I know a part of the work that Voto Latino does is combating disinformation among Latino voters. Can you talk a little bit about what that disinformation looks like? What false narratives are being spread? How are they being spread? And as far as you know, who's doing it and why are they doing it?
It's so interesting. So one of the reasons that Voto Latino went down this rabbit hole, because it's a rabbit hole, Alex, of disinformation is because we realize that the real intent of disinformation is to sow doubt in the sanctity and integrity of our institutions. And if you sow doubt in their efficacy, if you sow doubt in their integrity, that they will work for you, you don't vote. You tap out. And so that erosion of democracy is something that is being faced worldwide, but disproportionately targeting new voters and voters of color. And it is because oftentimes our communities are the ones that have most to lose if government dysfunctions. in real ways. But if we keep showing up, then all of a sudden our needs of our communities have to be addressed. And we started studying disinformation back in 2016. What we saw in 2016, Alex, compared to what we see today, seems quaint. It was ads that were on Facebook that had Hillary Clinton texting saying you can vote on Wednesday or you can text your vote. No need to stand in line, in bilingual messaging. Facebook never took them down. They should have, because that is false political advertising. We had to sit down with Sheryl Sandberg and others to encourage them to be more present, I would say, more thoughtful. But they were saying, no harm, no foul, a lot of harm and foul. When you're talking about dissuading 1,000, 10,000 votes in states that were decided by less than 11,000 votes, like Arizona and Georgia, right? So these implications are very real. But what we have seen since then, in 2022, what we saw was don't vote in the midterms because nobody cares about you. The Democrats are no different than the Republicans. And it was very much targeting first-time voters and young voters and communities of color that were less attuned to what was happening in Washington. And then what the Latino did is like, well, you say, wait a second, you say neither party cares about you, but because you voted, you now have lower healthcare costs. Now you have access to $35 insulin. You have student loan forgiveness. So we were able to demonstrate that because they voted, there's a responsive government on the other side. And that changed behavior. Most recently, and this was what was really wild, we saw an active campaign for third-party candidates in Arizona, Texas, and Nevada that we did not see in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, targeting young Latinos on TikTok. And when we did our poll back in April, when Biden was still on the ballot, we found that 47% of Latinos in Arizona were going to vote for Biden, 38% were going to vote for Trump, and 17% were going to vote independent, 12% of them of which were for RFK. And what was surprising is that it was 62% of young women under the age of 35 that were interested in third party because of the messages that they were receiving that Biden didn't care about them and that Trump was too racist for them and that there was a progressive agenda that was going to answer their needs. The moment there was a shift of nominee where Kamala Harris became top of the ticket, this was in mid-July, we saw young Latinos in particular, 60% of Latino voters were going for Kamala Harris, 29% were going for Trump, and independents went down to 7%. And one could be, yes, they liked her, but part of it was that she was a blank canvas where there was not disinformation targeting her on TikTok right away, that she got the breath to define herself online in ways that even if you look at what happened to Hillary Clinton that had 30 years of definition from the far right, she didn't have to deal with that. Kamala Harris didn't have to deal with that. And so I think it's interesting that when you ask who's funding it, some of it is absolutely coming from the far right. But some of it, a lot of it, is coming from foreign agents that we don't know. There's a really great article for your listeners if they have not read it. It is from Ann Applebaum from The Atlantic, and it's the China-Russia propaganda machine. And it goes deep into how they are targeting election systems around the world. At the very end of the article, it was describing what we were experiencing in real time. And it was one of these things, I'm reading it, talking to focus groups, hearing it, and then I'm reading this article. It's like, oh my gosh, it was too lockstep and too prescient, but it was something that we have to learn to better monitor.
And Applebaum is great. We'll put that article in the show notes. So in getting prepped for this episode, there's this phrase that I came across dozens of times, which I'm sure means you've seen it thousands of times, which is Latinos are not a monolith. And of course, that's true. When you are using this blanket term Latino, we're talking about millions of people across, coming from a range of countries, have been in the U.S. for varying numbers of generations. But sometimes it does make sense to talk about Latinos as a group. Obviously, that's right there in the name, Voto Latino. Mm-hmm. Do you have thoughts about in what context it makes sense to talk about Latino voters or Latino people, and when might that label obscure more than it reveals?
It's so funny because I am very much on the folks, you're right that Latinos are not a monolith. But if you were to ask most people, what does that mean? They don't know. That's the end of the conversation, right? So it's like a nice cocktail conversation takeaway. I will tell you, again, I've been doing this work now for 20 years. And it is true that Latinos are not a monolith, but you have an alignment of Latino values of how you experience America, really depending on what state you live in. So with the exception of Florida, where you can embrace being Colombian and Cuban and Venezuelan and Mexican and walk freely in Miami without judgment, you could be from Arizona and fourth generation and go to 7-Eleven in the middle of the night to grab a bottle of milk and get pulled over for being undocumented. So there is a real sense in the Latino community that we are, oftentimes to say, we are the invisible that make the visible happen in the United States. We are disproportionately the labor. We are disproportionately the carers. We're disproportionately the ones that make the machines go on running. And that's because the average age of a white American is 47 years old and the average age of a Latino is 30 years old, right? We are a young, robust, young community that people have really little curiosity learning about, but are very quick to judge on whether or not we are undocumented, right? Close to 1 in 3 Americans, when they see another Latino, they have said that they are undocumented, when in fact, close to 80% of Latinos in this country are not only documented, but were born here. And so there has to be this major paradigm shift of multiculturalism in this country in order for us to be able to truly thrive. And again, when people say Latinos are not a monolith, I said, well, Latinos are very much an American context, because you go to Chile and tell a Chilean that they're Latino and they'll say, I'm Chilean, right? It's just like, and so it's, when you say, the country is changing super fast, Arkansas is one of my best case examples. When Governor Huckabee came to be, her second or third piece of legislation was to ban Latinx from all government forums. I'm like, that's curious to me. I asked my team, what is the elementary school makeup of kids in Arkansas? Because to me, that was coding. You're speaking in code if you care so much about this term. It turned out that there are whole pockets of Arkansas where the school system is 60 to 7% Latino. What did she do after banning Latinx? She's trying to privatize education, and she's trying to lower the labor age of children from 16 to 12 to work in factories until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. When people say that Latinos are not a monolith, that is absolutely true, because once we close our doors, we might have a different version of a pupusa and a taco at home, right? But the moment we walk out the door, there are real barriers for us to be self-realized and achieved as a person because of the systemic bias of institutions and how we're perceived by our neighbors and broader Americans at large.
Do you have comments on language? I mean, I think sometimes for non-Latino Americans, it can be difficult to talk about because, there's sort of these two competing terms, Hispanic and Latino. Recently, there's been a move towards gender-neutral language, Latinx or Latine. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason it's Voto Latino and not Votex Latinx or Civic Hispanic?
Yeah, well, first of all, we started 20 years ago before Latinx was a thing, right? And it's really interesting because this is where culture really becomes a big deal. So the word Hispanic in itself was actually devised by Ronald Reagan. And so it was very much became the official government term. It was a Republican. It basically gave a wink and a nod to Spain as well. So if you're Hispanic, you're technically also Spanish. But it omitted Latin America, where it recognizes our indigenous roots and our African roots, right? So, for example, I am of African descent, indigenous descent, Middle Eastern descent, and then some Spanish. So Hispanic omits everything except the Spaniard part of it, basically. And so Voto Latino was very intentional in recognizing the Latino piece of it. What most people don't know is that the reason Reagan added Hispanic as a terminology was that as a community, we were not recognized on the census until 1980. We were not fully enfranchised with access to the voting booth until 1973. So a decade after the Voting Rights Act, right? So for all intents and purposes, while we've been here since the inception of this country, we have not been recognized and our stories have not been told until most recently. And when it comes to Latinx, there's a huge debate of how to identify. And it's mostly among older generations feeling that the language is being bastardized. But I always tell my team and I tell folks, it's like, who am I to tell someone how they identify? Latinx is supposed to be non-binary, recognizing that there's a spectrum of how people identify. And if someone wants to own that word, why would I take that away from them? That is their identity. And so at Voto Latino, we use Latino, we use Latina, we use Latinx, and we use Latin. And Latin is a new one, right? And that is much more textbook. Latinx came out of the transgender community, and it was a lot of young people wanting to identify and be good allies to people who identified as non-binary. And Latin is more of the academic saying, well, the older people don't really like it, and so we might as well use this. And so it's more of like, we will use those three interchangeably. We rarely use Hispanic just because it came more of a government term that does not celebrate the totality of who we are as a community.
Well, thanks. I hope that helps people feel a little bit more comfortable talking about.
I felt like that was more than the abridged version. Next time I'll do a bridge.
No, that was great. So I want to ask a couple questions about kind of political behavior. And maybe as a way to get in that, you've already mentioned several times, Latinos are disproportionately younger.
Yep.
And the next generation is disproportionately Latino. So if you look at Latino voter behavior, there is a bit of a Democratic lean. There's also a lower voter registration, lower voter turnout, those are also true for younger generations. Mm-hmm. So to what extent do you think the age differences are playing into the sort of general depiction of Latino voting behavior? Or to what extent is there something distinct about Latino behavior?
So I think one is that the biggest challenge in the Latino community is that we have a voter registration gap. Because in fact, when Latinos are registered, 6 out of 10 will go vote. When we register them, 8 out of 10 will go vote. But because the majority of Latinos are under the age of 33, they're just coming into the system really fast, and keeping pace is really hard. And so if you were to ask me, like, one of the things that I would love to see is universal voter registration, making it automatic. There shouldn't be friction. But when it comes to getting young people out to the polls, it is really giving them the information they need in order for them to feel like they have made a right decision. And so most of the people that we increasingly register, the broader generation, Z and millennial, they register independent, but lean Democratic. But they don't want to feel like they are bound by a party. That's healthy. That's a healthy analysis. That's healthy of saying, I want people to support me, because they should. That is actually a place of politics. And when you talk to a young person, I don't have to convince them that climate change is real. I need to convince them that if they vote, they will be able to make impact on that climate change issue. And because I would say President Biden's agenda addressed climate change, has addressed some of these big issues that were really hard to move, including student loans, they are starting to understand that their participation matters. And I predict that in the next 10 years, we're going to see a massive amount of young people running for office. Maxwell Frost is the first Gen Zer, but he's not going to be the last. He's going to have a lot of friends really soon. And that's great for our democracy. One of the things that I have been in awe of, a fairly new democratic system, is that of Ukraine, where the average member of their parliamentarium is under the age of 42. Ours is in our mid to late 60s, right? And so the mid to late 60s does not reflect the largest generation of Americans that happen to be the alpha generation of my children who are in 7th and 5th grade, right? And so you actually want a massive amount of young people, not just voting, but really considering, how do you disrupt the system? And it's not by tapping out, but it's by occupying the halls of power and running for office and making sure that we are invigorated with really great, cool, new, fresh ideas.
So as you're mentioning there, being a little bit split between the parties can be a good thing in terms of having political power. I mean, it means that both parties are competing for your votes. There has been a bit of a trend over the last few election cycles of shifts in the Latino vote share. So this is according to data from the Council of the Americas. In 2012, 27% of Latinos voted for the Republican candidate. In 2016, it was 29%. In 2020, 32%. Now Trump is polling at about 38%. On the Democratic side, it goes from 71% to 65% to 66%. Now Kamala Harris is polling at around 56% of the Latino vote share. So that's not a huge shift. That's a shift over a span of a couple of decades, but it is a consistent shift. Yeah. How do you think about what's going on there?
So I think this is an opportunity for us to correct the record. In 2022, for example, it's the latest action of the Latino vote. When Ohio had the abortion bill on the ballot, folks will recall that the abortion bill was safeguarded. And the reason it was safeguarded was because of African American and Latino voters overwhelmingly voted to support it. The white community, including white women, were evenly split. And so these narratives that Latinos are deflecting to the Republicans, their vote behavior does not show it. I will tell you that in 2022, there was a 37% decrease in Latino participation compared to the midterms of 2018. The people that showed up in 2022 in the Latino community were overwhelmingly older Latino voters who track Republican. But the 37% decrease was vastly under the people under the age of 40. What has happened in the Latino community right now is that in the last 4 years, the headlines keep blaring that there is a rightward shift. The folks that read those are people that invest in both parties. So the Republicans are investing in the Latino community, and the Democrats basically withheld their funding. The fact that we saw a dramatic shift of a 37% decrease in Latino participation in 2022 was all on the Democratic side, not on the Republican side. And so if you talk to your voters, which is good practice, they're going to turn out for you. If you don't talk to them, they will stay home. In 2022, in Arizona, where we had Mark Kelly running for Senate in a tie-to-tie race, in September of that year, 50% of Latino voters had not received a phone call from the campaign or from the party. 50%. So what we did at Multi Latino is we dug in. It's like, well, who is not being contacted? This is now mid-September, right? Who's not being contacted? And it turned out that it was young Latino voters and low propensity voters. Sometimes it's the same person because by the rule of thumb, campaigns target people who have voted 5 times or more. If your population is disproportionately voters under the age of 33, they haven't had a chance to vote 5 times unless they're voting in all the elections, right? And so by default, you are not talking to the people that are going to get you to win. So one of the things that Multi Latino did is that we were supposed to invest in 5 states, $4 million. We were supposed to invest in North Carolina, in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada for our GOTV efforts. We ended up shifting all our $4 million and focused only on Arizona and Nevada with a simple reminder, telling young voters to go vote and low propensity voters to go vote. If you were to see who voted at the very end, it was young Latino voters, and they made all the difference in Nevada and Arizona. And what keeps me up at night was that we had to shift $4 million to ensure that these folks went out and voted. But that means that all of a sudden Georgia had to be spent tens of millions of dollars for a special election that didn't have to be, because I'm sure if we had to redirect our resources to these states, other organizations did as well. And we have to get out of a different mindset that low propensity voters are not worth our time when the majority of the progressive base is young.
Yeah, so I think that's something I hear a lot from voter registration organizations is the parties, in somewhat irrational fashion, tend to think, let's turn out our base, let's turn out people that we have consistently voted.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily a long-term strategy for the parties, and it also is...
Well, and Alex, I think, and this is where, again, there is a Kamala effect happening at the local level. And there is an opportunity in certain states, I would say in North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, even Texas, where the volume of young people that are not registered, but that are excited to jump into the game, there's an opportunity to close voter registration gaps. And by closing voter registration gaps, then what you're doing is that you're bringing them out of the shadows, and then everybody can talk to these voters. But right now, if they're not on a voter file, even though they're eligible, no one's talking to them. And so we are living a unique moment. And, this idea that, and I'll tell you, even just anecdotally, when the moment that Kamala Harris went on top of the ticket, we went out into the field. It was 2,000 registered Latino voters in 5 battleground states. And where Biden was at 47, she was at 60%. Trump went from 38% to 29%. And the independent went from 17 to 7%. It was the first time since perhaps Barack Obama where we saw Latino voters pulling from Republicans to the progressive agenda in ways that we hadn't seen. If anything, the trend that we saw before was more to where Latinos were when Bush was there, right? So it was settling back. But she's actually now rechanging and redefining the map to where Obama was. And that was before going into this last stretch of the election.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to ask a couple questions about immigration. So this is a big topic. We'll only have a chance to cover a little bit of it. But in brief, do you have thoughts on things that are working well in the U.S.'s immigration's current laws and institutions around immigration right now, and what isn't working in the U.S.'s immigration system?
We have no policy, I would say. There's no rhyme to reason to it. Most people say, well, cogently speaking, if you've been here for 10 years and you've been paying your taxes and you have a family and you're all, of course you should have a pathway to getting your green card and citizenship because it sounds logical. But if you've been here for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you've taken care of our children, you have fed us, you are teaching our children, taking care of our elderly, and you don't have that piece of paper and you're paying billions of dollars into our tax system, it sounds absurd. It sounds dystopian, and it creates so much vulnerabilities. And so what I would encourage the next administration to do is to actually identify and bring these people that are out of the shadows into a system that functions, because it all of a sudden ensures that there are fair wages. It ensures that people are not being exploited. It ensures that families are not living under microaggressions of who's the next person that wants to create mass deportation policy. It becomes very real. And so we have two issues when it comes to immigration. One is we have yet to address the folks that have been here for decades, that pay into the system, that are very much part of our communities. That's a domestic policy issue. And that is incumbent that it be addressed. You know, I sat down with President Biden and 3 other leaders in April, and we're saying the number one issue among a 22-year-old is housing. The second issue, what is the president going to do about my mother who's been here for 20 years, undocumented? We were able to convince him, and he signed an executive order that allowed spouses that were undocumented, married to American citizens, to finally come out of the shadows and apply for simple working papers. And it's called Parole in Place. The Republican Party immediately sued the administration for something that's common sense. It's so funny because, you know, I talked to the president, one of the things he said, well, you know, how are independents? I said, independent white voters want this too. And what I didn't say out loud is like, because they might be married to an undocumented loved one, right? It's really close to home. We don't live in silos. But then separately, as a country, we need to set up a system that allows people that want to come and work here in all the right ways to apply for their visas in their home countries. And we have to reckon with ourselves that when we say that, we're not just talking about the doctors and the lawyers and the scientists. We're talking about the labor. One thing that has made the American economy exceptional is that we've always attracted the best around the world, because everybody wants to come to the United States with this understanding that I can self-realize and define my future and myself in this country and nowhere else. And that's what makes us uniquely American. And unless we actually have those conversations with the American people, that immigrants are our DNA, and that's what revitalizes our economy. And that is quite frankly why we are the envy of the world. Then we're not going to be able to continue leading in the 21st century. And I am grateful because I'm a naturalized citizen. I know what it means because I've witnessed it had I grown up in the country of my mother's birth and my birth in Colombia. It's a beautiful country. The people are amazing. The government is not. And you cannot be self-realized in that country. But here in America, I can be, and so can my children. But we have to make sure that we are providing people with clarity on how the rules are. Right now, something that really stood out to me was a Venezuelan that was snarled up in the system at the border, right? And he said something that with the high wires and all the machinery and all of the defense stuff, it's like, it didn't look like an open country. It looked like a scared country. And I found that so impactful because there's nothing for us to be scared of, but we do have to create systems and practices and pipelines and supply chains and checks and balances that make sense. And there was a time when we did. So let's go back to that.
The Republican platform this year promises, quote, the largest deportation operation in American history. Should we take that seriously? Do you have a sense of what that would look like or what's at stake in this election?
I take everything the Republican Party says seriously, except for their promise for infrastructure plans. I mean, that's the one thing that never came about. And look, when Trump came down the escalator the very first time and said that Mexico is not sending their very best and sending rapists, there was not one Latino that knew that his dog whistle was at the Americans that were here that happened to present Latino. When Trump says that immigrants are poisoning the blood of Americans, he doesn't mean the people that just crossed. He's talking about my family and my children. He's talking about Americans. And when he says mass deportation, even if he were not to implement it, he is providing carte blanche to the far right to harass, intimidate, and harm fellow Americans. And if folks think that I'm going too extreme, I just need to remind people of the El Paso massacre, where a man jumped into his car, drove 10 hours, and killed 23 people because he was incited and inspired by Trump's tweets at the time, calling us invaders and criminals. And that was what he wrote verbatim in his creed that was found in his car, citing Donald Trump. If there is a scenario where mass deportation happens, it is a scenario where all of a sudden the country becomes militarized. If it's sanctioned by the government, if it's not sanctioned by the government, it's basically doing a wink and a nod to white supremacists, that anybody who is not white, who is brown outward facing, is fair game. I grew up in California under Pete Wilson. Pete Wilson is what politicized me. It politicized Governor Newsom. It politicized Senator Padilla. It politicized Vice President Kamala Harris, because we witnessed what in the most liberal state in the country, how our neighbors turned against each other. It was the first time I remember coming home from college. I was sick to my stomach of what I was witnessing in my community, that people were turning against my family and my cousins and treating them horribly. These are the same people that we went to church with, the same people that we went to school with. And I had that conversation with my family. I was like, we need to become U.S. citizens. You need to register and you need to vote. And just like I had that conversation, millions of young Latinos and Asian American children were having that conversation with their families. And California stopped being a swing state because we got our act together and said, it's at the voting booth that we solve and create resolutions. But the interim, that was hell. I remember being in 8th grade, growing up in Sonoma, California, and Napa, the city next to us, had a white supremacist national rally. You know how scary that is? For being a kid and saying, you don't know how that's going to shake up. The amount of hate crimes that went through the roof under Trump in the Latino community was underreported, because if you were undocumented or you were afraid that you were living with someone that was undocumented, you didn't even want to tell people.
You've just been describing a potential frightening future for the United States. Let's try to leave on a little bit more of a hopeful note here. And I want to ask about what your vision is for a pluralistic democratic society. So it's easy to say we want a pluralistic society in which different cultures are respected, but moral values are shaped by family and religion. So cultural change can be scary. And that's true for people that have grown up in this country that might feel like the culture is changing around them. It's also true for immigrants to this country who are seeing their children grow up with maybe different cultural values than the world they grew up in. But if we're going to be a democracy, those are values we need to pass on generation to generation. So what is your vision for America's democratic future where we maintain these important values of pluralism and democracy?
Our superpower in America is the fact that we are multicultural. That is our superpower. We attract the best and the brightest. We are curious people trying to be entrepreneurs in different sections of society. And that's what allows us to thrive. And our Achilles heel is racism. And that is what foreign agents actively try to use against us in the propaganda machines that they infuse across our social media platforms. But when we come together, and look, the United States right now, we are absolutely a social experiment. There has never been a multicultural democracy ever on earth. But how beautiful that it's happening in this very moment when globalization is far more dependent on the success of nations coming to terms with different viewpoints to thrive together. My children represent a multicultural generation, the Alpha generation. They are Latina, Jewish, South Asian, and they technically represent the largest cohort of children in the classroom, meaning that the largest cohort of American children right now are biracial, if not multiracial. The second cohort is Latino. So our children are already being integrated in a democracy and a multiculturalism that we have never experienced. How do we lean into them to make sure that they are provided the best access of information and institutions without bias? Oftentimes, we hear this idea that we are inheriting a country that our ancestors built. And I like to actually center it around us today, saying, actually, we are ancestoring. Every single decision we make today, we are ancestoring for the children already born. And how do we want to ancestor for our country? I want my children to have access to everything under equal rules where they present themselves as an American and not being defined by their circumstance. I want them to enter and make sure that they have more rights than I was born with. But right now, that is not the case. My daughter has less rights than her grandmother did. That's absurd and obscene. And so our job is to ancestor fairly to ensure that they have a thriving economy, they can be the best version of themselves, that the planet is safe, that they don't have to fear about doing drills in school because of guns. Like, there are opportunities for us to take ourselves seriously as leaders and seriously as Americans and do right by them, because they will be asking questions. But if you were to ask me where we are, I actually think that our brightest days are ahead of us because we haven't completely expanded our opportunity and possibility. But we are already at a level where this generation of Americans are more informed. We have more access to healthcare. We have more access to being able to build a better, brighter future collectively, and we should embrace it.
Well, María Teresa Kumar, thank you for all your work to bring America towards that better version of the future, and thank you for joining me on The Context. Thanks
so much, Alex.
The Context is a production of the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. I'm Alex Levitt, a senior program officer and historian with the Foundation. The episode producer for this show is George Drake Jr. Melinda Gilmore is our director of communications. People only listen to podcasts if they hear about them. So if you like the show, please help spread the word by telling a friend about us, or leaving us a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can learn more about the Kettering Foundation or subscribe to our newsletter on our website, kettering.org. If you have questions or comments about the show, drop us a note. Our email is thecontext@kettering.org. We'll be back in this feed in 2 weeks with another conversation about democracy. The views expressed during this program are critical to us having a productive dialogue, but they do not reflect the views or opinions of the Kettering Foundation. The Foundation's broadcast and related promotional activities should not be construed as an endorsement of its content. The Foundation hereby disclaims liability to any party for direct, indirect, implied, punitive, special, incidental, or other consequential damages that may arise in connection with this broadcast, which is provided as is and without warranties.